Alright, let's settle in for tonight's journey. We are about to explore the grim, perilous, and profoundly unglamorous world of the medieval assassin. These are the shadowy figures we imagine creeping through castle corridors and darkened alleyways, a blade in their hand, ready to quietly reshape the course of history. While popular stories often paint them as impossibly cool characters, the reality of being an assassin in the Middle Ages was a truly dreadful experience. So, as you get comfortable, I invite you to like this video and subscribe if you appreciate the content we are creating together. I'm always fascinated to learn where our listeners are tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. So feel free to share that in the comments. It's a wonderful way to see our community connecting from all across the globe. For now, go ahead and dim the lights. Perhaps turn on a fan for some gentle, ambient sound, and let's ease into our story for the evening. Let us be perfectly clear about one thing. No one during the medieval period simply woke up one morning and felt an urge to end a nobleman's life for a handful of silver coins, only to spend the next 3 days hiding in a barrel. The role of an assassin wasn't a career you chose. It was more like the final, unfortunate destination on a life filled with hardship. Most medieval assassins were not enigmatic loners trained in remote mountaintop temples. They were, more often than not, desperate peasants, disgraced soldiers, former thieves with a steady hand, or people so far on the fringes of society that their involvement in a murder would go entirely unnoticed. If you were a person of means, you didn't become an assassin, you hired one. If you possessed a title, owned a piece of land, or even had a single goat to your name, you were in a position to give orders. But if you had just managed to escape a debtor's prison, had earned a reputation for resolving issues, and could blend into a crowded tavern without drawing attention, then your prospects were different. Sooner or later, someone was bound to slide a purse of coins across a worn wooden table and whisper a name in your ear. And that name would almost certainly not be a simple one. You would not be hired to eliminate a quiet turnip farmer named Bob. The targets were typically corrupt barons, excessively wealthy bishops, or figures protected by a dozen bodyguards and a wide moat. The payment offered was tempting, and the task itself was horrifying. But by the time a person was willing to consider such work, they usually had nothing left to lose, no family, no prospects for the future, and certainly no dental coverage. Furthermore, there was a complete lack of job benefits. There was no retirement fund, no path to glory, and no nights off. You couldn't exactly promote your services with a sign that read, "Discreet eliminations, by appointment only." Instead, you were required to stay quiet, move with haste, and never, ever reveal your profession, especially not while shouting over a pint of ale at the local inn. If asked, you might claim to be a traveling carpet salesman, explaining away any suspicious stains as spilled dye. So no, this was not an aspirational role. People became assassins because life had already chewed them up and spit them out, leaving them with nothing but a cloak and a rusty dagger. You were not the hero of the story, nor were you the main villain. You were a nervous footnote in history, unlikely to survive long enough to even spend your payment. Let's begin by dispelling the first great myth. Medieval assassins did not train by candlelight in some hidden monastery, guided by wise mentors to the sound of inspirational flute music. There were no cinematic training montages, no dedicated teachers, and no motivational speeches. Any skills you might have possessed were learned through the simple act of surviving your first few attempts. Most of these individuals were desperate amateurs who had a good sense of direction and the ability to climb quietly without sneezing. If you had prior military experience, that was considered a significant advantage, as it suggested you knew which end of a knife was the sharp one. If not, while the act of stabbing might be fairly intuitive, escaping afterward with both of your kidneys still inside you required either great skill or, more commonly, an incredible amount of luck. There were no training manuals, no guild orientation meetings, and certainly no safety briefings. You were not taught how to identify a body double or where nobles typically hid their secret escape routes. These were lessons learned on the job, perhaps while dangling from a windowsill, wondering if you had once again mistakenly broken into the servants' quarters. And what about poison? That was largely a matter of trial and error, with a heavy emphasis on the error. Sometimes it worked as intended. Other times, the target would only feel a bit lightheaded and develop a deep-seated suspicion of their soup. And on occasion, you might accidentally drink from the wrong cup yourself. There was no medieval poison control to call, only hope, herbal guesswork, and the need for a very strong stomach. Of course, if you were exceptionally lucky, the kind of lucky where you find a gold coin in a dead man's shoe, you might have learned a few tricks from seasoned thieves or mercenaries. Perhaps an older assassin showed you the secret to moving silently across cobblestones. But mentorship was far from the norm. It was a rare and fleeting gift because assassins seldom retired. They simply vanished. As for weapon training, you can forget that entirely. You wouldn't be carrying a broadsword. Your arsenal consisted of a dagger you had likely stolen from a guard, maybe a garrote if you were feeling particularly ambitious, and whatever else you could hide under your cloak without making a jingling sound. So, no, you were not some master of shadowy martial arts. You were just a person with calloused hands, quiet feet, and an unhealthy familiarity with the city's back alleys. Success didn't come from training. It was born from raw survival. You learned to kill by doing the deed quickly, perhaps messily, and then disappearing before anyone had a chance to sketch your face and nail it to a church door. In short, your education was brutal, practical, and came with no graduation ceremonies. Only bruises, bloodstains, and the chilling knowledge that you were completely on your own. Let's discuss the primary motivation for becoming an assassin. The money. The cold, heavy, clinking coins that were wonderfully spendable. The promise of this reward is what lured you into this dangerous life. But the reality of payment was often a lesson in deception. When someone hires an assassin, they are not seeking a long-term professional relationship. They want a one-time service with no paper trail and, ideally, no surviving witnesses, and that often included the assassin. They might propose a pouch of silver with half paid up front and the other half delivered upon completion of the task. That was if they were feeling particularly trustworthy. But the catch was that, upon completion, was often code for, after we've confirmed you didn't fail, embarrass us, leave a trail leading back to our door, or manage to survive long enough to tell anyone about it. So you would carry out the mission. You would navigate the shadows, put your life on the line, and perhaps end a baron in his sleep. It was not a pretty or poetic business. And when you returned to collect your final payment, you might be met with, "Ah, yes, about that. The client seems to have vanished. A terrible shame." Or worse, they might simply try to kill you. A knife in the gut was always a cheaper option than paying a bonus. Even when you did get paid, the amount was rarely sufficient. It wasn't enough to cover the risk, the bloodshed, or the 3 days you might have spent hiding in a haystack, fighting off fleas and a sense of moral decay. You would receive a handful of coins, a curt nod, and a stern reminder, you were never here. And here's another delightful possibility. Some contracts were nothing more than elaborate political traps. You could be hired to eliminate a dangerous figure, only to find out it was a decoy surrounded by guards who were waiting for you. Congratulations, you've just walked into a sting operation, and your name is already being carved onto the gallows. Even if the arrangement was genuine, you couldn't exactly file a grievance in court. You could hardly say, "Your Honor, I would like to sue Lord Edmund for a breach of my assassin contract." The only court you were likely to see was one where you were the main exhibit. So you learned to take what you could get, to demand as much payment up front as possible, and to trust absolutely no one. Not even the shifty scribe who swore this job would change your life. And it did, though mostly by making it drastically shorter. To be an assassin was to live on a foundation of broken promises, constantly trying to vanish before those promises broke you completely. So you've taken the job. You've been misled about the pay, and you're probably going to die. Now let's talk about your equipment. You can discard any ideas you have from fantasy novels or video games. There were no retractable wrist blades, no smoke bombs, and no enchanted daggers. Your entire toolkit was made up of whatever you could steal, sharpen, or hide under a tattered cloak without making a noise. If you were incredibly lucky that, finding a gold coin in a dead man's shoe, kind of lucky you might have a decent dagger. It wouldn't be ornate, and it certainly wouldn't be curved like a dragon's tooth. It would just be a sharp piece of metal, hopefully free of rust, and ideally one that didn't still smell of your last job. Poison did exist, of course, but it was not the elegant solution of a slow drip into a wine goblet. Most medieval poisons were highly erratic, made from a concoction of plants, minerals, or even the entrails of a toad. Some of them worked instantly, while others took hours to take effect. And some would only cause your target 2 days of intense vomiting, after which they would recover, angrier than before and now deeply suspicious of all future stews. Ropes could occasionally be useful. You could use one for strangulation, for climbing, or for tying something up. But you had to be very skilled at using it quickly, because nothing ruins a stealthy moment quite like fumbling with knots while muttering, "Wait, how does this go again? What about bows?" They were effective, certainly, if you happened to own one, knew how to use it, and were not trying to sneak it into a palace while disguised as a flower arranger. Most assassinations were intimate, up-close affairs. There was no time for graceful marksmanship, only for a quick, quiet, and hopefully not so messy resolution. And you had no backup equipment. If your blade bent, broke, or fell into a well, it was time for improvisation. A slate roof tile? Maybe. A rusty nail? It was worth a shot. A shoe buckle wielded with malicious intent? Desperate times certainly called for desperate measures. You carried your tools discreetly, hidden in the hems of your clothes, in your boots, or even inside a hollowed-out loaf of bread if you had to. And you kept them close, not for a sense of safety, but because in this line of work, your weapon was your closest friend, your demanding boss, and your only retirement plan. There were no equipment upgrades, and no meticulous gear adjustments between missions. You didn't polish your kit. You just prayed it wouldn't fail you in the middle of a strike. Because in the end, it wasn't the weapon that did the killing. It was you, alone, poorly equipped, and expected to perform miracles with what amounted to little more than a spoon and a prayer. Assassins were not hired to eliminate random drunks in dark alleyways. No one was going to pay you to take care of Jeff, the sleepy candlemaker. Your targets were important people. Nobles, bishops, military officers, and sometimes even royalty. And these people were exceptionally well protected and difficult to kill. First of all, there were the guards. Not just one or two of them, but dozens. They were armed, armored, and well-fed. Some stood watch at the front gates, while others patrolled the rear. Some were just there to look intimidating, daring you to make a single wrong move. You would have to spend days carefully memorizing their patrol patterns, the specific creaks of certain doors, and exactly how many stairs it took before the guard with asthma needed to take a break. Secondly, there were the walls themselves. Castles did not have inviting front porches. Instead, they featured formidable gatehouses, deadly openings known as murder holes, and moats that were often filled with biting creatures. If you managed to avoid falling into the water, you still had to deal with arrow slits and the threat of boiling oil. Yes, boiling oil. Your job description essentially included the line, "may be flambéed for peeking." Thirdly, there were the countless servants and staff, the cooks, the scribes, and the stable boys. One wrong look from you, and they would be whispering to the captain of the guard faster than you could stammer out, "I'm just here to deliver some herbs." Assassins weren't just fighting against swords. They were fighting against gossip. And in medieval times, gossip traveled at an incredible speed, especially if it meant someone could keep their own head attached to their shoulders. And finally, your actual target was justifiably paranoid. These powerful individuals were surrounded by backstabbers, relatives who wanted their titles, and dozens of people who only pretended to be loyal. They would not eat any food without a taster trying it first. They would not go to sleep without 3 locks on their bedroom door. Some even used decoy beds or would rotate which room they slept in, playing a deadly game of musical chairs. And don't get your hopes up if you heard they were attending a feast. Yes, they might be drunk, but you would likely have to be drunk as well to blend in. And you would still need to get past the royal guards, 3 protective dogs, a very alert jester, and 50 witnesses holding tankards of ale. Even getting physically close to your target could take weeks of work. Posing as a servant, bribing a chambermaid, or hiding in barrels. And when the perfect moment finally arrived, you had only one chance. One precise, silent, bloodless moment to strike and then vanish into the night. If you failed, You would become the next public deterrent, swinging from the castle gate with a sign that essentially said, "Nice try, let's be honest with ourselves." When you imagine a medieval assassin, you probably picture someone in sleek black robes, with leather bracers, and perhaps a mysterious hood that billows in the moonlight. The reality was much different. You likely looked more like a sickly goat herder who had something to hide. Disguises in the Middle Ages were not exactly high fashion. You didn't have access to custom-tailored cloaks or retractable armor. You had whatever you could find. Peasant rags, a monk's robe that was 2 sizes too big, or the remnants of a guard's uniform that still smelled faintly of its previous owner. The entire goal was to blend in. But blending in meant looking like everyone else, which is to say, like someone who hadn't bathed in 2 weeks, who limped from old injuries, and who had a nervous twitch from malnutrition. You weren't suspicious because of what you wore. You were suspicious because you were constantly adjusting your belt to hide a dagger that was wrapped in cheesecloth. And you can forget about masks. There were no Guy Fawkes masks available. Most face coverings would simply make you look like you had leprosy, which was an excellent way to avoid conversation but a terrible way to get into social gatherings. If anyone questioned who you were, you had to think on your feet. I'm Brother Tobias. I specialize in silent prayer and rooftop maintenance. Even if you managed to get past the guards, noble households were not filled with fools. The servants noticed unfamiliar faces, especially faces belonging to people who fumbled with chamber pots and couldn't identify the cook's cat. You were always just one. I've never seen you before, away from being assaulted with a candlestick. And if your disguise actually worked, congratulations. You now had to stay in character for hours on end, pretending not to notice all the highly stab-worthy people who were wandering past. Also, wigs did not exist. If you needed to look older or younger, your only option was to smear dirt on your face, squint a lot, and hope that no one got close enough to realize your beard was stuck on with honey. The truth is, your disguise offered very little protection. At best, it bought you maybe 5 minutes of confusion. After that, you needed to be gone, invisible, or exceptionally convincing. And if anyone saw through your disguise, well, let's just say that no one wants to be the assassin who gets caught in the bishop's laundry room, wearing a nun's habit and clutching a sword, especially not on a feast day. In medieval times, if you were an assassin, you worked alone. You didn't have a sidekick with a crossbow, a cunning alchemist in a secret lab, or a handler who sent you coded messages and words of encouragement. You had only yourself, a rusty dagger, and a crippling inability to trust anyone. There were no guilds, at least none that you could actually rely on. If there were rumors of a brotherhood of assassins going around, it was mostly just tavern gossip, fueled by too much mead and boredom. You were more likely to meet a ghost than another professional killer who was interested in networking. And why this isolation? Because in your line of work, the fewer people who knew you existed, the longer you were likely to live. Every person you talked to was a risk. Every careless word was a potential noose. Even the client who hired you might not know your real name. And if they did, you were already planning your escape. Companionship was laughable. Friends asked questions. Lovers would notice the bruises, the bloodstains, and the fact that you always slept with a blade under your pillow. You couldn't settle down. You couldn't afford to. One mistake, one person recognizing your face in a busy market, and your entire life would become a desperate race for the nearest sewer grate. Even other criminals kept their distance. Thieves and smugglers were often sociable, but you were the person who made other people disappear. They were afraid of you, or worse, they saw you as a walking liability. No one wanted to share their stew with someone whose profession could attract a mob with torches. And you could expect no sympathy. You couldn't talk to anyone about how hard it was to sleep after you had silently strangled a corrupt bishop. If you talked about your job, people would assume you were either lying or dangerous, and they wouldn't be wrong on either count. So you guarded your secrets, your scars, and your weapons all by yourself. In inns, you would sit in the darkest corner, with your back to the wall, your eyes constantly scanning the door. You never drank too much. You never stayed for more than one night. You didn't give out your name unless someone paid you for it first, and even then, it probably wasn't your real one. Being a medieval assassin meant mastering the art of vanishing, not just from a crowd, but from every life you never had the chance to live. Let's imagine that you accepted the job. You planned your route meticulously. You successfully bribed the right doorman. You even managed a very convincing disguise as a chimney sweep. And then you froze. Perhaps the target turned around unexpectedly. Perhaps they were with their child. Or maybe you just had a sudden fit of tremors at the worst possible moment, and the hand holding your knife started to quiver like a terrified squirrel. Well, guess what? You are now dead. Because for a medieval assassin, failure was not a minor issue that resulted in a poor performance review. It resulted in a public, painful, and wildly theatrical death, often involving ropes, fire, wheels, or sharp iron tools with names like the Bone Cracker's Delight. Failing to make the kill meant that the entire operation was compromised. Your target would survive and immediately tell everyone that someone had tried to kill them. Suddenly, you were no longer a shadow. You were a wanted man, with a detailed description and probably a crude drawing of your face posted on every tavern wall for 30 miles. And those guards you so expertly bypassed before? Now they were highly motivated. Sometimes your biggest worry wasn't even the target, but your own client. If you failed, you went from being an asset to a liability, someone who could be tortured, interrogated, or worse, forced to talk. The very people who hired you would be the first to put out a second contract, this time on your head. And there were no second chances. There was no, "Sorry, my blade slipped. I'll give it another try tomorrow." You had one shot, one brief moment in time. And if you messed it up, the best you could hope for was a quick death before anyone found out who had hired you. Failure also brought with it a quiet, humiliating shame. You didn't just fail to kill. You failed to remain invisible, to be perfect. And for an assassin, perfection was the same thing as survival. Anything less than that, and you might as well paint a target on your own back and start rehearsing your final words. It didn't matter how many successful jobs you had completed in the past. No one cared that you had succeeded 12 times before, because in this profession, you are only as good as your last kill. And if your last kill didn't happen, you had better start running. So you did it. The plan worked. The dagger found its mark. There were no screams, no guards, just a clean collapse to the floor and a very important person who was no longer important. Congratulations. Now run for your life. Being a successful medieval assassin did not involve sipping wine on a rooftop while the city burned below you. It meant running through back alleys with someone else's blood on your boots and a dog already sniffing your trail. There was no victory lap, no celebratory drink with your colleagues, and no casual meeting with your client to discuss how it went. You didn't even get a moment to admire your own work. The instant your blade struck, your new main objective was to escape from everyone who now wanted to kill you in increasingly creative ways. The guards were approaching, the doors were locked, the horses were stabled on the other side of town, and you were probably bleeding. You had to have your escape meticulously planned before you even attempted the assassination. The routes, the disguises, the fallback safe houses. Maybe you had a boatman who owed you a favor, or at least one who wouldn't ask too many inconvenient questions. Because the city would go into lockdown within minutes. No one wanted a scandal. And a lockdown meant closed gates, armed checkpoints, and a dozen angry men with swords, all of whom had been given your rough sketch and the unsettling description. Possibly armed and extremely stabby. And what about the client? Assuming they actually planned on paying you, they certainly weren't going to meet you at a cozy tavern with a smile and a thank you card. They would probably vanish as well. Because an assassin who has just completed a job is the most dangerous person alive. You knew too much. You had proven that you could get into places that others couldn't. So even when you succeeded, you walked away with payment in one hand and a giant target on your back. And what did you really gain? A week of sleeping in grimy lofts, bribing ferry captains, shaving your beard in the dark, and pretending your name was Brother Lucian as you tried to blend in with a group of monks who were heading east. Because success did not guarantee survival. It simply meant that you had to restart the entire grim game in a new city, under a new name, with even more people hunting for you this time. So yes, you made the kill. Now run like hell. If being a medieval assassin wasn't miserable enough already, being poor, constantly hunted, and sleeping in places that smelled of goat, you also had to deal with the wonderfully creative paranoia of everyone around you. Because in the Middle Ages, assassins were not just feared, they were thought to be cursed. To the average peasant, you were not just a killer in a hood. You were some kind of unholy creature who whispered to demons and smeared frog guts on your blade under a full moon. Why else would you be able to slip past guards and vanish into the darkness? Logic was not particularly common back then, but superstition? Oh, that was everywhere. Some people believed that assassins could change their shape. Others claimed you were invisible unless someone doused you in holy water. A popular story suggested that assassins made pacts with forest spirits and could breathe death through walls. Imagine walking through a village and hearing a woman mutter to her friend, "Don't make eye contact. He might put a hex on the baby." Even your tools were viewed with suspicion. You carried a dagger? Clearly, it was forged in accursed fire. You used poison? That wasn't chemistry. That was witchcraft, and you probably stirred it with a severed toe under a blood moon. You might think that this widespread fear would be good for you, that it would make people avoid you. But the reality was far worse. Superstitious mobs do not wait around. They don't ask questions. They throw stones, they start fires, and they yell things like, "Burn him before he calls down lightning." Your reputation made people overreact. The moment someone died unexpectedly, from an illness, an accident, or from choking on a chicken bone, someone would whisper, "Maybe it was a shadow man. Maybe it was him." You could be hunted down just for being in the same village where a suspicious death occurred. This meant that you had to keep moving constantly. If you stayed in one place for too long, a priest would suddenly start ringing a bell while 5 angry farmers came at you with pitchforks, as if they had been waiting for this moment their entire lives. And heaven help you if you were caught with anything remotely unusual on you. Dried herbs, strange coins, or even a foreign accent. That was all it took for someone to scream, "Sorcerer," and light a torch. In a world that believed monsters could wear human faces, being too quiet, too clever, or too fast made you a threat. And in medieval logic, threats had to die quickly, and preferably by fire. A poison, the supposed weapon of elegance for an assassin. A quiet kill with no mess and no screaming. Just a sip, a stagger, a sigh, and it's over. That's the theory, at least. In practice, trying to poison someone in the Middle Ages was like trying to win a bar fight with herbal tea and a bad attitude. First of all, poisons were unreliable. You didn't have access to purified cyanide or a convenient little pill that was labeled fast-acting doom. You had plants, mushrooms, minerals, and maybe the occasional toad. You had to gather the ingredients, grind them up, and then pray. And even then, your concoction might only give the target a stomachache and a renewed dedication to their anti-assassin security team. There was no scientific way to measure the dose, you just had to eyeball it. A pinch too little, and the noble would just vomit and cancel his dinner plans. A pinch too much, and you might fall victim to it before the first course was even served. Furthermore, medieval kitchens were chaotic places. You couldn't just walk in and season the soup with nightshade. You had to bribe or pretend to be a cook, sneak in without being noticed, or worst of all, try to poison a meal that was going to pass through 3 food tasters and a dog. Yes, a dog. And if your victim was a noble, they didn't just eat their food. They treated it like a military operation. Meals were tasted, blessed, and sniffed by everyone from the steward to the jester. By the time the food got to their plate, it had been through more security checks than a royal wedding. Even if you did succeed, you slipped the poison in, it went undetected, and the target actually ate it. What happened next was wildly unpredictable. Some poisons took hours, some took days. One moment your target might be laughing at a joke. The next, he could be clutching his stomach and demanding to see his astrologer. And if they survived, guess who would be blamed? Not the cook, not the taster. You, the quiet person with a knowledge of herbs and twitchy eyes. So, poisoning was not an efficient method. It was risky, slow, and full of variables, none of which were in your favor. And if you were caught, you wouldn't get a swift death. You would be interrogated with various tools until you confessed to poisoning everyone from the Duke to his dog. You might think that if you successfully changed the course of history by removing a tyrant, sabotaging a royal bloodline, or silencing a political threat, someone would remember your name. But no, you were an assassin. That meant your name was never meant to be remembered. At best, you became a rumor. Some figure in a hood, a mysterious foreigner with cold eyes, or the quiet person at the inn who never finished his ale. You could have pulled off the most legendary assassination of the century and still be recorded in the official history as a mysterious death. In fact, that was the whole point. Your client didn't want a story. They wanted to be able to plausibly deny everything. The fewer people who knew who did the deed, the safer they were, and the less likely they were to end up being poisoned by their own assassin. So your name was buried the moment the job was done, assuming you even used a real one to begin with. You didn't sign your work. You didn't boast about it. You didn't keep trophies. You simply ceased to exist outside of the precise moment of the kill. And if someone did know your name, that was a loose end. And in your line of work, loose ends had a very short lifespan. And forget about honor. There were no medals for being silent, no stone monuments for the person who stopped a war with a single dagger in the night. If a noble wanted a statue, they had one made of themselves. You would get a wooden box, an unmarked grave, or, if things went particularly badly, your head on a spike with a sign that said, "Traitor." Sometimes your name was only known so that it could be cursed. You would become a whispered warning. Don't cross the king. Remember what happened to Lord Ulrich? Yes. And the man who did it? Gone, like a ghost. That was your legacy. Not fame, not fear, just absence. You weren't supposed to leave a mark. You were supposed to vanish. And if you stuck around long enough to become known, that was a fatal mistake. Because in the medieval world, heroes were remembered. Assassins were erased. So you survived. You completed the task. You even managed to get paid, which was a miracle in itself. Now all you had to do was lie low, keep your head down, and trust that your client would honor their agreement and protect your identity. Right? Wrong. Because in the world of medieval assassination, there was one rule that was even more sacred then. Don't get caught. Never trust anyone, especially the person who is paying you. Your client, whether they were a noble, a merchant, or a bishop with a lot of ambition and very loose morals, didn't hire you because they respected you. They hired you because they needed something terrible done, and you were the sharpest tool they could find operating in the shadows. Once the job was finished, you instantly became a liability. You knew too much. You knew who wanted who dead, when, why, and potentially how much they were willing to pay for it. That made you dangerous, not just to their enemies, but to them. So what did they do? They would deny you. They would deny they had ever met you. Or worse, they would send someone else to eliminate you, to close the contract with something sharper than ink. There were even cases where clients would double book, hiring one assassin to do the job and another to immediately kill the first one afterward. No refunds, just reduced risk. And if you dared to try to blackmail a client, to threaten to expose them, that was a bold move. And it was also your final mistake. Because powerful people in the Middle Ages did not negotiate with assassins. They crushed them. If your client had a shred of honor, which was a truly rare thing, you might get paid and be left alone. But even then, you would have to assume that they were watching you from a distance, with someone already sharpening a blade and memorizing the way you walk. You were the secret that could not speak, the shadow that could not linger. Even success was not enough to earn trust, because in their eyes, if you had killed once, you were capable of killing again. And no one, not even the person who hired you, wanted to be next. Let's imagine that somehow you beat the odds. You survived the assassinations, the deceptions, the poisonings, and the betrayals. You outlived your enemies, your employers, and probably your own moral compass. Now what? Do you retire? Absolutely not. Because in medieval times, assassins did not have retirement plans. There were no farewell parties, no quiet cottages by the sea, and no pensions paid in gold coins and grateful whispers. You didn't fade away into a peaceful life. You vanished or you died, and often both. The problem was simple: you were never truly safe. Even if you walked away from the profession, your past would not. You carried too many secrets in your mind, too many names in your memory, and too much blood on your hands. People didn't want you to be retired. They wanted you to be forgotten, which usually meant being buried. And even if no one was actively looking for you, and that's a big if, you had to live with the constant fear that someone might be, that a new assassin, young and eager to prove themselves, had just been given a contract for a shadowy figure who used to be someone dangerous. So you would change your name again. You would move to a village where people didn't ask a lot of questions. You would fake a limp, sell herbs, and pretend you had once been a guard. But even then, you could never sleep peacefully. You avoided crowds. You always sat facing the door. You kept your dagger hidden under the floorboards, next to the pouch of coins you never touched because it still smelled of the person you had earned it from. And you couldn't even trust yourself. Years of silent killings and swift escapes did something profound to your mind. Every knock on the door made you flinch. Every stranger on the road might be someone who recognized you. You stopped dreaming because dreaming was dangerous. You couldn't love. You couldn't relax. You couldn't laugh too loudly. You existed as a ghost pretending to be a man. The truth was, there was no good ending for a medieval assassin. There was just a slow, cold slide into obscurity, constantly moving, constantly watching, until one day you slipped into the darkness and no one even noticed you were gone. And perhaps that was the best outcome you could hope for. By now, you have probably grasped the reality. Being a medieval assassin was not darkly romantic. It was not noble. It was not even particularly profitable. It was a grim, thankless, and short-lived profession, cloaked in blood-stained linen and constantly hunted by people who wished you were dead. You would not last. Not a week, maybe not even a day, because you would start out with the wrong ideas. That you would be sleek, in control, a mere whisper in the dark. But in reality, you would be cold, hungry, and one bad guess away from the gallows. You would slip into town with your cloak pulled tight, ready for action, only to find out that your target had moved. The guards were drunk, but quick to react. And the stable boy you paid for information had just sold you out for a mug of ale and a piece of bread. You would freeze at the critical moment, stab the wrong person, or be seen by someone's maid who had once seen your face near the chapel. And suddenly, you are not a shadow. You are the problem. Then what? You run. But you are not used to the medieval terrain. The thick mud, the uneven cobblestones, and the absolutely astonishing number of loose chickens in the street. You would slip, fall, and be tackled by a guard named Thomas, who had just been through a breakup and was looking for a way to vent his frustration. And let's say you survive that. Then you have to deal with the aftermath. No allies, no honor, and no future. Just whispers, constant suspicion, and the growing realization that even if you succeed, the best you can hope for is to die old and alone, hidden behind a false name in a village that still believed in fairies. So no, you wouldn't last. And frankly, you shouldn't even try, because the life of an assassin was not glamorous. It was a cruel machine that consumed people and produced nothing but shadows. It offered power without peace and a purpose without a place in the world. You didn't make history, you erased yourself from it. And the only thing waiting for you at the end was silence. A silence that no one would question, because no one even remembered you were there in the first place. Before she was the feared queen of Macedonia, Olympias was known as Myrtale, a princess from the rugged tribal lands of Epirus. Her people claimed to be direct descendants of the legendary Achilles. And whether the blood of heroes truly ran through her veins or not, one thing was certain. This was not a woman who was destined to live on the fringes of history. From a young age, Myrtale was surrounded by an air of mystery and ritual. Her upbringing was shaped not just by politics, but by prophecy, ecstatic rites, and a deep reverence for the ancient gods. She was not the kind of princess who just smiled and embroidered tapestries. Instead, she was drawn to serpents, omens, and the frenzied ceremonies of the cult of Dionysus, where women would dance barefoot in the moonlight, summoning the divine in a state of trance. Her connection to the gods was not a performance. It was deeply personal. She didn't just worship. She seemed to embody the divine. According to ancient sources, which were likely written by men who were both terrified and fascinated by her, she kept sacred snakes in her chambers and even let them coil up beside her in her bed. Whether this was literally true or the kind of sensational story that powerful women often attract, we will never really know. But the image stuck. To her allies, it made her seem divine. To her enemies, it made her seem dangerous. Her true power began not on a battlefield or in a throne room, but in the unsettling flicker of torchlight among the whispers of priestesses and the sinuous movements of serpents. She was not just a princess. She was a living oracle, a woman who was touched by something older than politics and colder than steel. So when Philip II of Macedon, a brutal, brilliant, and famously promiscuous king, arrived at the island of Samothrace for a religious initiation, he didn't just meet a beautiful princess. He encountered a mystery that he could not resist. Their marriage was not just a political alliance. It was a collision of prophecy and power. And from the very beginning, it was full of omens. Some stories claim that lightning lit up the sky on their wedding night. Others said that Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt entering her womb. All of this would eventually become legend. But one thing is for sure, the union of Olympias and Philip didn't just produce a child. It produced Alexander the Great, and she intended to shape his destiny from his very first breath. Olympias's marriage to Philip II was far from the fairy tale one might imagine for a queen who would one day give birth to an empire. From the start, it was a volatile mix of prophecy, pride, and paranoia. Philip, ruthless, charismatic, and already collecting wives like trophies, married Olympias around 357 BCE. She was likely just a teenager, but she was far from naive. She saw in Philip a man whose ambition matched her own, and perhaps even a divine partner for her spiritual destiny. Macedon was not an easy kingdom to enter. It was a land of iron and unchecked ambition, where kings were murdered by their cousins and brothers became rivals overnight. But Olympias, the priestess from Epirus, entered with her head held high, her eyes already set on the crown. Their marriage was troubled from the beginning. Philip, for all his political genius, was not a monogamous man. He would go on to marry multiple women, often for strategic alliances and always for power. But Olympias was not one to quietly fade into the background. She maintained her own court, cultivated her own alliances, and was known to consult oracles and perform rituals to see her own future, and perhaps Philip's fate. Then came the birth of Alexander. Even that event was shrouded in celestial drama. Legends say that Olympias dreamed that a thunderbolt struck her womb, and that flames danced around her child without harming him. Philip reportedly had a vision of sealing his wife's womb with a lion. Yes, a literal lion. Whether they truly believed these visions or deliberately made them up, they certainly acted as if Alexander was destined to rule not just a kingdom, but the entire world. But even as the child was being celebrated, the cracks in the royal marriage grew deeper. Olympias resented Philip's other wives, especially his Macedonian bride, Cleopatra Eurydice, whom he married later in his life. This was more than just a domestic dispute. It was a profound threat. Cleopatra was born in Macedonia, and any son she had would be considered purer, in the eyes of the local nobility, a direct challenge to Alexander's future. Olympias saw the danger clearly. The palace was not just a home. It was a battlefield, and she would use every snake, dream, ritual, and whispered rumor she had to make sure her son was not just remembered, but crowned. She was no longer Myrtale. She was Olympias now, and no one would take her son's throne without facing her wrath first. By the time Alexander was a teenager, the Macedonian palace in Pella had become a war zone of thinly veiled insults, calculated political moves, and bitter rivalries. Olympias was not just fighting for influence. She was fighting for her own survival. She knew that the court was full of snakes, but she was the one who had taught them how to bite. Philip II had begun to distance himself from her. He was campaigning more often, drinking more heavily, and perhaps most dangerously, listening more and more to his Macedonian advisors. The final blow came when he married a young noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice, not to be confused with the Cleopatra of Egypt. This Cleopatra was Macedonian-born, and her uncle, Attalus, was one of Philip's most trusted generals. To Olympias, it was not just a betrayal. It was an open declaration of war. The wedding ceremony itself was a disaster. At the feast that followed, Attalus drunkenly insulted Olympias and Alexander, questioning the legitimacy of Alexander's birth. Was he really Philip's son, or was he, as Olympias often claimed, the child of a god? It was meant as an insult, but Olympias shrewdly embraced the myth. Let them whisper. Let them believe her son was touched by Zeus. It made him untouchable. Alexander stormed out of the feast. Olympias completely left Macedon and went back to Epirus. But her exile was not a defeat. It was a strategic withdrawal. In her homeland, she was still royalty. She could gather support, discreetly influence people, and watch as Philip's palace began to crumble from the inside. She didn't need to be physically present to be dangerous. Then came the seismic shock. Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding, just as he was about to invade Persia, on the very brink of crowning himself not just king of Macedon but potentially emperor of the known world. The question that echoed through every marble corridor and torchlit hall was the same. Who was responsible? Was it Pausanias, the jilted bodyguard who carried out the act? Was it the result of court intrigue? Was it Alexander himself? Or, and this was whispered softly, was it Olympias? No one could prove it for sure. No one dared. But many believed it. After all, within days, Cleopatra Eurydice and her newborn child were dead. Murdered, some claim, by Olympias herself. The serpent had indeed returned to the palace. And now, nothing stood between her son and the throne. With Philip dead and Macedon in a state of mourning, or perhaps confusion, Olympias made her move. While others were scrambling to make sense of the chaos, she acted swiftly, brutally, and decisively. First, Cleopatra Eurydice, the young Macedonian queen and rival wife, was eliminated. According to chilling stories, Olympias didn't just have her killed. She arranged for her death to be symbolic, public, and humiliating. Some say that Cleopatra was forced to hang herself after watching the murder of her infant daughter. Others claim that Olympias had the child thrown onto a funeral pyre. What everyone agrees on is this: no mercy was shown. Olympias understood something that many mothers in ancient courts refused to accept. In a royal palace, mercy is a fatal weakness. A rival child, no matter how young, represented a future conflict. And Olympias was done playing defense. With Cleopatra and her bloodline wiped out, she could then focus on securing Alexander's throne. Her teenage son, bold, brilliant, and already tutored by Aristotle, was declared king without much opposition. But make no mistake, it was not just his charisma or his father's legacy that made this possible. It was Olympias. She knew which generals to threaten, which nobles to flatter, and which enemies to discreetly remove. She was not just protecting her son's rise to power. She was meticulously engineering it. Alexander himself did not always approve. He reportedly disapproved of the violence against Cleopatra's family, but he also didn't do anything to stop it. Because deep down, he understood what Olympias had always known: power demands bloodshed. And in Macedon, bloodlines were both a blessing and a curse. With her son now king, Olympias began to withdraw a little from public life. But this was not retirement. She simply shifted from open attacks to subtle influence. As Alexander prepared to launch his conquest of Persia, she stayed behind, not as a passive queen mother, but as the spiritual guardian of his destiny. She sent him sacred relics, consulted oracles, and performed rituals on his behalf. To Olympias, her son's mission was not just military. It was divine. Alexander was not just going to war. He was fulfilling a prophecy. And as long as she was alive, no rival, Macedonian, Persian, or otherwise, would get in the way of that divine plan. She had crowned her son. She had purified the palace. Now, she would protect his empire from behind the scenes with her teeth bared. As Alexander marched east to conquer the known world, Olympias remained in Macedon. A queen without a throne, but undeniably powerful. Her official title was Queen Mother, but she governed in all but name. Though the regency was technically given to Antipater, one of Alexander's trusted generals, Olympias refused to be sidelined. She wrote letters to her son constantly, offering advice, giving warnings, and sometimes scolding him. These were not the tender letters of a doting mother. They were political briefings mixed with oracles and venom. And Alexander, thousands of miles away, carefully read every word. She reminded him of who his true enemies were. She questioned the loyalty of his companions. She criticized his growing fascination with Persian customs, his choice of wives, and his audacious flirtation with claiming to be a god. No one else dared to say these things to him, but Olympias was never afraid to speak her mind as a mother or as a priestess of divine will. Back in Macedon, Antipater grew more and more resentful. Olympias undermined him at every opportunity. She used her status, her religious authority, and her family connections to stir up opposition against him. She had significant influence in Epirus, in Thessaly, and among the aristocracy. She could spread rumors like wildfire, and with Olympias, a whisper could be more deadly than a sword. Meanwhile, her letters to Alexander became more urgent. She warned him of Antipater's ambition, painting him as a second Philip, ready to betray and usurp him. Whether she truly believed this or simply feared losing her grip on power, she continued to pressure her son to act. Alexander, however, hesitated. He needed Antipater to maintain order in Greece while he was fighting in Asia, and so the gap between mother and general grew wider. Olympias watched. She waited, but beneath her religious robes and maternal concern, she was growing impatient. She had not been through years of palace warfare just to be ruled by an aging soldier. As Alexander's empire expanded from the Aegean to India, Olympias saw vulnerabilities. He was trying to do too much, trusting too many foreign advisors, and drifting away from the mother and the gods who had raised him up. She believed his victories came from divine favor and from her own influence. And if he forgot that, well, Olympias knew how to remind kings of their true origins, even if that king was her own son. When the news of Alexander's death in Babylon reached Macedon in 323 BCE, it did not arrive with a triumphant trumpet call. It arrived like a sudden dagger. For Olympias, it was not just the loss of a son. It was the collapse of the entire world she had carefully built over decades. Her boy, the divine storm she had prophesied, nurtured, and unleashed upon the world, was gone, and he had left behind no clear heir, no single successor, only complete chaos. The mighty empire he had carved out was already breaking apart. His generals, his so-called successors, were already carving it up like jackals circling a carcass. Antipater still held power in Macedon and Greece, and he had no love for Olympias. Worse, her daughter Cleopatra, Alexander's sister, was being pursued by rival generals for marriage, each one hoping to use her bloodline as a claim to the throne. Olympias foresaw what was coming. Civil war was not a possibility. It was a certainty, and once again she would have to act. But she no longer had Alexander. What she had instead was his bloodline. His young son, Alexander IV, who was born to Roxana, the Bactrian princess Alexander had married. Roxana, who was still in Macedon, was vulnerable. The boy was even more so. Olympias knew that the infant was now the last true piece of her son's legacy, making him both a target and a powerful weapon. She allied herself with Roxana and the child, determined to protect them and use the boy's birthright to assert her own claim in the political arena. But the tide was turning against her. The generals who had once bowed before Alexander had no interest in kneeling to his widow or his mother. They now had armies, their own ambitions, and they held grudges. Olympias did not flinch. She had faced snakes, traitors, and kings. A few warlords with crowns and stolen spears would not intimidate her. So she plotted. She waited. She watched as Antipater died and was succeeded by his son, Cassander, a man with ice in his veins and no tolerance for the old queen's scheming. It was only a matter of time before these two forces collided, the serpent mother of Alexander and the cold-eyed usurper who wanted her dead. Alexander was gone, but his shadow still loomed, and Olympias was still coiled within it, ready to strike. Years after Alexander's death, as his sprawling empire broke apart into civil war, Olympias made her most audacious move yet. She returned to Macedon, not as a grieving mother, but as a political force embodying divine fury. The regency had splintered. Cassander, the son of her old enemy Antipater, was seizing power, and Roxana, along with young Alexander IV, was effectively a prisoner. Olympias knew the danger was imminent. If she didn't act immediately, her grandson would disappear like a shadow at dusk. So she made an alliance with Polyperchon, an aging general who still had a flicker of legitimate authority. Olympias would return not to beg, but to rule. With Polyperchon's support, she entered Macedon at the head of an army. And the moment her feet touched her homeland, everything changed. Towns opened their gates. Soldiers defected to her side. Even some of her old enemies hesitated. Olympias, despite her age, was still a name that made the very ground tremble. Then came her vengeance. One by one, she hunted down Cassander's loyalists. And when she finally captured Philip III Aridaeus, Alexander's mentally impaired half-brother and puppet king, she ordered his execution. According to some sources, his wife, Eurydice, was captured and given the chance to take her own life. When she refused, Olympias had her strangled. It was brutality disguised as royal protocol, and Olympias, ever the theatrical figure, staged the scene as a goddess delivering divine justice. Her message was clear. Only Alexander's bloodline had the right to rule. Everyone else was a pretender. For a brief, burning moment, Olympias held the kingdom firmly in her grasp. She had restored the dynasty. She had avenged betrayals. She had reminded Macedon what royal power looked like when it was wielded by a woman with nothing left to lose. But power in Macedon was like fire in dry grass. And Cassander was still at large, calculating and biding his time. He returned with a vengeance. His army was larger than hers, his resources were greater, and his cruelty was colder. Her allies began to desert her. Polyperchon's influence faded. The tide had turned. Olympias, now isolated within the fortress of Pydna, watched as her enemies closed in. She had lit the match, Macedon had burned, and now the smoke was thick, with her enemies at the gates. Olympias, once the most feared woman in the ancient world, now found herself besieged in the coastal fortress of Pydna. Alone, cut off, and surrounded by the army of Cassander, who had come to finish what his father had started. But Olympias did not beg. She did not plead. For nearly a year, she endured the siege like a statue carved from divine wrath. Food ran out. Disease began to spread. Allies vanished. Yet within the fortress walls, she maintained the same unwavering presence that had once intimidated kings. To the very end, she carried herself not as a prisoner, but as the mother of a god. Cassander, always cautious, hesitated. He knew that killing Olympias was dangerous. Even now, she was wrapped in a myth-like armor. She was still the mother of Alexander the Great. To strike her down might be seen as blasphemy. So he offered her safety. "Surrender," he said, "and her life would be spared." Olympias knew better. She had seen too many royal promises turn to ash. Still, hunger was no longer just an inconvenience. It was a sign of impending death. Her garrison broke. Her followers surrendered. And Olympias, unyielding until the very end, was finally handed over to her enemies. Cassander did not execute her himself. That would have been too simple, too merciful. Instead, he delivered her to the families of those she had executed during her brief return to power. Let them decide her fate. They condemned her to death. But here's the strange twist. When the executioners arrived, no one dared to strike the first blow. Olympias stood tall, regal and silent, her eyes fixed on them like an oracle gazing through smoke. These were Macedonians. They had grown up hearing tales of her rituals, her visions, her snakes. They had once cheered her son as a living god. And now here she stood, a frail old woman cloaked in myth. And not a single man had the courage to swing the sword. So Cassander sent others, foreigners, outsiders, people who had no memory of her power, only orders to follow. And so, Olympias was finally struck down, not with ceremony, not with dignity, but with silence. Her death marked the definitive end of Alexander's bloodline in any meaningful position of power. And with it, the final ember of an empire founded on divine ambition was put out. But even in death, Olympias left behind a profound shadow, and history would never forget the Serpent Queen. Olympias died not on a throne, but in the dust, unarmed, abandoned, and executed by the very people she once commanded. But history works in strange ways. It doesn't always favor those who die peacefully in silk sheets. Sometimes it remembers those who went down hissing. And Olympias was never destined for quiet obscurity. In life, she had wielded motherhood like a sword and prophecy like a shield. She was not just the mother of Alexander the Great. She was one of the architects of his rise. Without her, there would be no myth of the divine child, no whispered rituals of thunderbolts and lions, no ruthless purging of rivals that cleared the path for a teenage king to rule the known world. Olympias didn't just give birth to an empire. She defended it with ferocity. Yet even among the ancient world's most ruthless rulers, Olympias stands out. She did not lead armies in the field like Cleopatra or charge into battle like Boudica. Her battlefield was more subtle and colder. It was a world of poisoned goblets, strategic political marriages, priestesses, and oracles. She understood the power of fear and, even more importantly, she understood the power of belief. She made people believe her son was divine, and she may have even believed it herself. Her enemies called her a murderer, a witch, a manipulator, and they were not entirely wrong. Olympias was all of those things and more. She was a product of a brutal world that valued cunning far more than kindness. And she learned early on that mercy was a luxury that queens could not afford. In the centuries that followed, she was both vilified and mythologized. Some called her a villain, others a visionary. But no historian, ancient or modern, could dismiss her as irrelevant. She haunted Alexander's legacy like a ghost, always in the background, always just behind the curtain. And perhaps that's exactly where she belonged. Not as a tragic mother or a footnote in a king's story, but as a compelling narrative all her own. The woman who cloaked herself in prophecy, shared her bed with snakes, and outlived gods. Olympias's bones turned to dust long ago, but her legend lives on in every tale of ruthless queens, in every whisper of blood-borne destiny, in every empire built on myth. She is still there, coiled in the dark, patiently waiting. On the sun-bleached island of Crete, just a few miles south of the modern city of Heraklion, there is a ruin that feels more like an ethereal dream than a real place. Stone corridors wander in every direction. Rooms twist and double back on themselves. Staircases go up to nowhere. Even today, it's easy to get lost. This place is Knossos, the vibrant heart of the Minoan civilization and the supposed inspiration for one of the most enduring myths in human history, the Labyrinth of the Minotaur. But before there was a legend, there was a magnificent palace. Palace unlike any other. Built around 1900 BCE and expanded over centuries, Knossos was not just a royal residence. It was an entire city under one roof. Spanning nearly 150,000 square feet, it had over 1,000 rooms, light wells, vast storage magazines, shrines, workshops, and what may have been the world's first flushing toilets. It had running water, multi-story apartments, and a complex air circulation system. This was no primitive fortress. It was an architectural marvel. To modern archaeologists, Knossos looks like organized chaos. To ancient visitors, it probably felt like pure magic. The person who brought Knossos to modern attention was the British archaeologist Arthur Evans. In the early 1900s, Evans excavated the site and quickly became convinced that this was indeed the origin of the Greek labyrinth myth. The layout was confusing, the architecture was deeply symbolic, and everywhere he looked, he found images of bulls, painted on walls, carved into stone, or sculpted into tiny golden charms. The bull, after all, was sacred to the Minoans. Evans even went so far as to name the civilization after the mythical king Minos. Whether Minos was a real historical figure or not, his legend became forever linked with the ruins. But here's the twist. No literal labyrinth has ever been found. No underground maze, no prison cells, no half-man monster. What we have instead is something far more mysterious. A city designed in loops, wings, and layers that is deliberately hard to navigate. And the deeper you go, the more the lines between history and mythology blur. So the question remains, was the Minotaur born from these very walls? Or was the palace itself the monster? Gnosis may not give up its answers easily, but it is excellent at making you ask the right questions. The myth is as famous as the ruin. A monstrous half-man, half-bull trapped inside a labyrinth so complex that no one who entered ever found their way out. Only Theseus, the Athenian hero, managed to slay the beast and emerge, with the help of a ball of thread and the cleverness of Princess Ariadne. But where did this story come from? And why a labyrinth specifically? The earliest versions of the myth tell of King Minos, the powerful ruler of Crete, demanding a yearly tribute from Athens of 7 boys and 7 girls. These unfortunate souls were offered to the Minotaur, a creature born from divine punishment and deep shame. The Minotaur, imprisoned in an underground maze, symbolized the dark side of power, something savage hidden behind grandeur. To the ancient Greeks, Crete had long been a land of immense wealth, deep mystery, and palpable fear. Its seafaring inhabitants, the Minoans, were seen as both elegant and strangely foreign. Their rituals involved daring bull leaping, their artwork showed unfamiliar gods, and their palaces were unlike anything seen on the mainland. To a Greek visitor from 1000 BCE, Gnosis might have felt like a completely different world. The bull itself had a sacred meaning in Minoan culture. Frescoes vividly show young men and women vaulting over charging bulls in ritualistic displays. Horns of consecration, stylized bull horns, adorned rooftops and altars. Combine this with a palace that feels like a maze, and the ingredients for a legend begin to come together. But what if the Minotaur was not just a monster? What if it was a metaphor? Some scholars suggest that the tale reflects a historical memory of Cretan dominance over the Aegean, a time when Athens genuinely paid tribute to a stronger, more mysterious power. The labyrinth could symbolize the political subjugation of weaker states, and the Minotaur the raw, terrifying force behind Minoan rule. Others argue for a more psychological interpretation. The labyrinth as the unconscious mind, the Minotaur as our hidden primal urges, and Theseus, the hero bravely venturing into the darkness, guided only by the thread of memory. Still, the myth remains forever linked with Gnosis. The palace is the closest tangible thing we have ever found to a real labyrinth. No monster, no Ariadne, but perhaps something far deeper. Not just a myth echoing through history, but a history that longed to become a myth. Long before Athens built its majestic marble temples or Sparta sharpened its fearsome spears, there was the Minoan civilization, one of the earliest advanced societies in Europe. They exercised power not through military conquest, but through extensive trade, exquisite art, and what seems to be an almost supernatural mastery of architecture. At the core of their influence was Gnosis, a palace that was far more than a royal residence. It was a vital hub of culture, ritual, and economic activity. The Minoans flourished from about 2600 to 1400 BCE based on the island of Crete. They developed a vast trade network that stretched to Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and even the distant shores of Spain. Their ships glided through the Mediterranean like silent arrows, carrying pottery, saffron, bronze, and luxurious goods. They didn't build huge armies. Instead, they built relationships, and this, more than any weapon, brought them immense wealth. What is most striking about Minoan culture is how different it is from their later Greek successors. Their artwork celebrated nature, animals, and graceful human movement, rather than focusing on war or divine punishment. Frescoes show dancers, playful dolphins, and athletes vaulting over powerful bulls. Even their goddesses look different. Formidable, bare-breasted figures, often holding snakes, symbols perhaps of fertility, transformation, or protection. At the center of it all was Gnosis, not a fortified stronghold on a hill, but a sprawling complex in a fertile valley. It lacked massive defensive walls, suggesting the Minoans either felt secure on their island or projected enough power to make such defenses unnecessary. Their confidence was reflected in their architecture. Multi-story buildings, colonnaded courtyards, and advanced plumbing systems hinted at a society far ahead of its time. And yet, despite all their sophistication, the Minoans left behind no deciphered written records. Their main script, Linear A, is still unreadable today. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know the beliefs of their kings, the prayers they said, or what really happened behind the mysterious walls of Knossos. All that remains are their ruins, their art, and their enduring influence, which was later absorbed by the Mycenaeans and echoed in Greek myths. The Minoans were not just builders of palaces. They were architects of mystery. And Knossos was not just a building. It was the pulsating heart of a civilization that shimmered briefly, like sunlight dancing on the Aegean Sea, and then vanished. But some say their echo still roams the maze. To walk through Knossos is to embark on a journey through time. A layered, perplexing, yet beautiful expanse of time. It's not just the sheer size that is overwhelming. It's the intricate design. Rooms lead into other rooms. Corridors diverge and abruptly end. Light wells slice through the very core of the building. Staircases spiral into impenetrable shadows or unexpectedly open up into sunlit courtyards. Nothing follows a straight line. It's not hard to see why ancient visitors might have whispered the word labyrinth. Knossos was not just a palace. It was a living, breathing organism. Spanning an estimated 150,000 square feet, the complex had over 1,000 chambers, some tiny, some magnificent. These were not randomly placed rooms. They were meticulously designed workshops, vast storage areas, sacred shrines, apartments, and grand throne rooms, all arranged around a large central courtyard that may have hosted public ceremonies or daring bull-leaping rituals. The palace was built on multiple levels, reaching up to 4 or 5 stories in some sections, using natural slopes and artificial terraces. To navigate it without getting lost, you would need a sharp memory, keen instinct, or a guiding thread like Theseus. And yet, this apparent chaos hides a remarkable intelligence. The Minoans mastered passive ventilation, cooling rooms through clever air shafts and open stairwells. They channeled rainwater through sophisticated clay pipes and even had toilets that flushed long before Rome made the concept popular. One of the most iconic areas is the so-called throne room, named for the alabaster chair built into the wall, flanked by benches. Around it are frescoes of griffins, mythical guardians. Was this the seat of a priest-king, a goddess's private chamber, or a sacred court? No one knows for sure. And the walls, they speak in vibrant color. Vivid frescoes show dolphins swimming above bathtubs, women in elegant, flounced skirts with bare chests, and youths gracefully leaping over bulls in midair. The art was not just decorative. It conveyed an identity, fluid, natural, and deeply connected to the earth and sea. Still, the deeper you go, the more Knossos begins to disorient you. Some sections seem intentionally complex, as if they were designed to confuse. Perhaps that's the true origin of the labyrinth legend. Not a prison for monsters, but a palace that felt alive. A building that inspired awe, invited ritual, and held just a hint of fear. No locked doors, no mythical beasts. Just a place built to make you question where you were and what was around the next corner. Knossos was not just an administrative center or a royal residence. It was a place of deep worship, an architectural embodiment of the Minoan soul, deeply imbued with ritual, myth, and divine mystery. Unlike later Greek temples, there are no towering columns dedicated to Zeus or grand marble shrines to Athena. Instead, the spiritual world of Knossos is more subtle, woven into the very fabric of the building itself. Shrines are hidden in corners. Pillars rise like sacred sentinels. Horns, stylized, carved, symbolic, appear on rooftops and altars. Everywhere you look, the bull motif is dominant, suggesting a powerful connection between worship, the natural world, and this revered animal. The Minoans did not seem to fear the bull. They celebrated it. The famous bull-leaping fresco in Knossos is more than just athletic art. It may show a profound religious rite. Young men and women vaulting over a charging bull, locked in a dance of danger and grace. It was not just a sport. It was sacred theater, possibly an offering to the gods or a symbolic triumph over chaos. Then there are the snake goddesses, found in storerooms beneath the palace. These figurines are among the most iconic Minoan artifacts. Bare-breasted, with their arms raised, and with serpents coiled in their hands or around their bodies, these figures radiate power. They are not submissive idols. They are formidable guardians of the household, of fertility, and perhaps of life itself. To the Minoans, snakes symbolized renewal, rebirth, and mystery, creatures that belong to both the earth and the underworld. The rooms where these objects were found suggest household shrines or ritual spaces, quiet sacred corners nestled within the palace's bustling heart. Combined with the frescoes, the horns, the altars, and the labyrinthine corridors, the entire complex begins to feel like a ritual machine, a structure built not just for living, but for connecting with the divine. There is no centralized temple at Knossos because the palace itself was a temple. Its layout, art, and design were all part of a spiritual worldview where the boundaries between the sacred and the secular simply did not exist. This was a place where myth was architectural, where a corridor could become a passage to the gods, and where every echo in the stone chambers may have once been a whispered prayer. Knossos didn't just house people, it housed gods. For centuries, Knossos stood as a beacon of prosperity, innovation, and cultural sophistication. But then, something happened. Something sudden, something that no one can fully explain. By about 1400 BCE, the palace was abandoned, its frescoes left to fade, and the once mighty Minoan civilization that had commanded the seas vanished like mist over the Aegean. So what happened? Theories abound. Some point to natural disasters. Around 1600 BCE, the volcanic island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, had one of the largest eruptions in human history. The huge blast likely caused tsunamis that battered Crete's northern coast, devastating ports and farmlands. Ash clouds may have blocked out the sun, suffocating crops and disrupting the climate. While Knossos was not immediately destroyed, the aftermath of the eruption may have significantly weakened its foundations, economically, politically, and spiritually. Others look to warfare. By 1450 BCE, the growing power of the Mycenaeans, mainland Greeks, may have taken advantage of Minoan vulnerabilities. Archaeological evidence suggests that Knossos was briefly reoccupied, but the culture had undergone a profound change. The art became more warlike. Linear A, the Minoan script, was replaced by Linear B, which was used by Mycenaean scribes. The palace that once thrived with snake goddesses and bull dancers now echoed in a foreign language. Some scholars believe the Mycenaeans did not invade in a single overwhelming attack but rather gradually absorbed the island, first through trade, then through cultural influence, and finally through direct rule. Others argue that internal collapse, a civil uprising, political instability, or the failure of the elite may have contributed just as much to its demise. What is striking, however, is the lack of violence seen in the ruins. There are no charred skeletons, no widespread signs of mass slaughter. Knossos did not fall with a scream. It faded with a whisper. The grand palatial system simply stopped working. The rooms fell silent. The rituals ended, and nature slowly reclaimed the site. By the time Homer sang of Crete in his epics, Knossos was already an ancient myth, a memory mixed with stories of kings, monsters, and labyrinths. And perhaps that is fitting, because what ultimately extinguished Knossos was not just a volcanic eruption or an invasion. It was time, and the inevitable way that all great things, no matter how beautiful, eventually fall under the weight of new empires. But the bones of the palace remain, and if you listen closely, the maze still hums beneath the earth. For thousands of years, Knossos lay buried under the Cretan soil, just another forgotten mound of stone lost to the mists of time. Its name was erased from memory, its myths were distorted, and its once magnificent walls were swallowed by olive groves and dust. That is, until one man decided to chase a legend. His name was Sir Arthur Evans, and he didn't just rediscover Knossos, he dramatically reimagined it. In 1900, Evans, a British archaeologist with a flair for the dramatic and a deep love for Homeric myth, bought the land that covered the ancient ruins. Local farmers had been finding strange seals and artifacts, tantalizing clues that something huge lay hidden beneath their feet. Evans began his excavation. What he found would forever change the history of the Aegean. He uncovered a palace so vast, so intricate, and so technologically advanced that he became convinced this was the mythical home of King Minos. The frescoes, the bull horns, the sheer architectural strangeness of the site. All of it pointed, in his mind, to one conclusion: the labyrinth. Evans was not just an archaeologist. He was a master storyteller, and at times a controversial one. He named the people who built Knossos the Minoans, after Minos. He interpreted symbols, meticulously reconstructed frescoes, and restored parts of the palace using reinforced concrete, a decision that has drawn both praise and criticism. Some call it visionary, others call it vandalism, because what you see today at Knossos is a mix of ancient ruin and Edwardian imagination. Still, Evans did what no one else had dared. He breathed new life into Knossos. He gave Europe a glimpse into a Bronze Age world far older than classical Greece, a civilization characterized by art, mystery, and maritime elegance. He also found the still undeciphered linear A script, raising new questions about language, literacy, and the limits of our historical understanding. But Evans did more than just excavate stone. He brought a myth back to life and forced historians to face the fact that behind the legend of the labyrinth lay something real, something complex, something profoundly human. A palace that felt like a maze, a civilization that faded into shadow, and a man who peeled back the earth only to find a story far stranger and more beautiful than he had ever imagined. Knossos had slept for 3,000 years. Evans was the one who rang the bell that woke it up. To walk through Knossos is to journey through a language of symbols. Frescoes, carvings, patterns, they are everywhere. But the Minoans did not give us a Rosetta Stone. Their main script, linear A, is still undeciphered. So instead of reading their thoughts, we have to see them, etched on plaster, carved into walls, and hidden in intricate patterns. What exactly were they trying to say? The art of Knossos is unique in the ancient world. There is no pervasive obsession with warfare, no endless rows of kings or battle-hardened heroes. Instead, we find nature. Leaping dolphins, blossoming lilies, birds in graceful flight, and sacred bulls. The human figures are vibrant, elegant, often shown dancing or taking part in rituals. Even in scenes that imply danger, there is an underlying rhythm and beauty. The Minoans were not chronicling conquests. They were celebrating life cycles and, perhaps, a cosmic order. The most iconic symbol, however, is the double axe or labrys, found throughout Knossos in shrines, on frescoes, and even etched into stones. The double axe is believed to be a religious symbol, possibly connected to a female divinity or celestial cycles. Some scholars suggest that the very word, labyrinth, might come from labrys, making the labyrinth not a maze at all, but a house of the double X, a sacred space, not a trap. Then there are the horns of consecration, stylized bull horns placed on top of walls and altars. These may have served as religious markers, separating sacred space from the mundane. Combined with the frequent depictions of bulls and bull-leaping rituals, it is clear that the animal had deep spiritual significance. Whether it represented nature, fertility, chaos, or a divine presence is still a matter of debate. But the bull is undeniably omnipresent. Even the layout of Knossos may have a symbolic meaning. Some archaeologists believe it was built not just for functionality but to mirror celestial or seasonal patterns. Its winding corridors and nested rooms could represent a journey through life, through death, or through the underworld, a spiritual maze rather than a physical prison. But without a deciphered script, every theory walks a fine line between genuine insight and pure imagination. The Minoans communicated through symbols, not explicit stories, and so we are left to interpret. What is Knossos truly saying? We see the rhythms, we see the images, but the ultimate meaning, that remains just out of reach like a thread unraveling into myth. Knossos is undeniably a ruin, yet it does not feel lifeless. Walk its corridors today, and you will sense something humming just beneath the surface. Not ghosts, not gods, but echoes of myths, of lives, of questions that stubbornly refuse to go away. Thousands of years after its decline, Knossos continues to hold us captive in its maze. Tourists explore its halls, archaeologists tirelessly search for answers, and writers weave new tales inspired by its enduring shadow. The Minotaur may be a myth, but the pervasive feeling of the labyrinth is profoundly real. We do not know who ruled Knossos. We do not know the names of its kings, queens, or priests. We do not know the prayers they whispered or the laws they lived by. But we know they cherished beauty. We know they revered nature. We know they understood the delicate balance between architecture and art, between ritual and reality. And we know they were pioneers. Before the Parthenon, before Rome, before the Hebrew temples or the Persian palaces, there was Knossos, a palace that was also a city that was also a temple that may have also been a story, because perhaps that is what the labyrinth truly is. Not a prison, not a puzzle, but a narrative carved in stone, a myth in architectural form. The legend of the Minotaur did not come from thin air. It came from this very place, from the confusing nature of its corridors, the reverence of its bull rituals, and the deep awe it inspired in generations who struggled to understand it. The Greeks turned it into a story. We turned it into archaeology. But at its very core, Knossos has always been both. Today, we can explore its ruins in broad daylight. We can take photographs, draw maps, and even reconstruct its frescoes. But the mystery has not vanished. The line between fact and legend still shimmers like heat haze over stone. Perhaps that is why Knossos endures, because it doesn't provide all the answers. It reminds us that sometimes history is not meant to be solved. It is meant to be experienced. And Knossos, ancient, intricate, half-remembered, is not just a location on a map. It is a profound question, one that draws us deeper with every step. And like Theseus, we are all still following the thread. Ancient engineers knew exactly what they were doing. The earliest battering rams were handheld. Teams of soldiers would simply pick up a tree trunk and slam it against enemy defenses like a group of frenzied lumberjacks. But over time, the battering ram evolved significantly. Engineers realized that by mounting the ram inside a wheeled frame, often with a roof to protect the crew from arrows and boiling oil, they could turn it from a simple tool into a weapon of terror. The Assyrians, who were masters of siege warfare, turned rams into psychological weapons. Their siege towers combined rams with archer platforms, which meant that a city's gates could be systematically destroyed while the defenders were under constant fire. Relief carvings from Nineveh show rams with pointed iron tips advancing towards the gates of rebellious cities like slow-moving gods of destruction. And they were not just focused on the main entrance. Rams were often used to breach weak points in walls, demolish watchtowers, or completely collapse gatehouses. Their very presence sent one clear message: surrender, or watch your defenses crumble like stale bread. The Greeks refined them. The Romans perfected them. Roman engineers built huge rams called ares, which is Latin for ram, and suspended them by chains or ropes inside enormous siege shelters. Some of these were so big that they required dozens of men to operate, and the rhythmic swing of their massive beam was said to sound like thunder rolling across stone. And yet, for all their brute force, battering rams required serious teamwork. The operators had to keep the ram swinging in sync while also defending it from burning missiles, falling stones, and all kinds of nasty substances that were thrown from above. A stalled ram quickly became a destroyed ram. Still, when a battering ram gained momentum, true momentum, it became virtually unstoppable. It was wooden power versus human masonry. It was ancient physics turned into a weapon. And it was just the beginning of how engineers would make walls weep. If the battering ram was the brute force, the catapult was the strategic mind. Where rams smashed up close, catapults attacked from a distance, launching not just stones but also a deep sense of psychological dread. They were the first true artillery pieces in military history, and they revolutionized siege warfare by turning physics into a weapon in ways that seemed almost magical to the enemy. The earliest catapults came from the Greek world around the 4th century BCE, and they were the product of brilliant minds who were looking for ways to extend the range and impact of warfare. Dionysius I of Syracuse, a tyrant with a love for cutting-edge violence, commissioned the first torsion-powered catapults, devices that used twisted bundles of sinew or hair as tension springs. These were not just oversized slingshots. They were precise instruments designed for siege terror. The genius was in their mechanics. Engineers discovered that by tightly twisting ropes, often made from animal sinew, They could store a huge amount of potential energy. When released, this stored force could hurl stones, javelins, or even flaming projectiles for hundreds of meters. The two main types quickly evolved: the ballista, which launched massive bolts like a giant crossbow, and the stone-throwing catapult, which lobbed boulders over walls or directly at fortifications. Then came the Roman engineers, who always found ways to improve on Greek innovations. They built catapults that could be taken apart, transported on carts, and put back together on-site, creating portable siege engines for professional armies. Some Roman catapults could launch 60-pound stones at incredible speeds, capable of tearing through wooden gates, battlements, and occasionally unfortunate soldiers. Catapults were not just about destruction. They were also about spectacle. Ancient generals used them to send messages, sometimes quite literally. Corpses were launched over walls to spread disease and fear. Severed heads were lobbed into besieged cities to shatter morale. In one chilling case, diseased bodies were fired into enemy territory as an early form of biological warfare. But catapults had their limits. They were heavy, required skilled crews, and could be made useless by bad terrain. Still, when they were used properly, they could batter a city into submission from a safe distance. And for the first time in history, cities realized that their formidable stone walls did not just have to withstand a ram. They had to endure attacks from the skies. Because now, destruction arrived by air. If the catapult was clever, the trebuchet was majestic. Towering, groaning, and terrifying, it was the undisputed monarch of medieval siege warfare. When one of these appeared on the battlefield, it was more than just a weapon. It was a profound statement. It announced, "Your walls are meaningless." Unlike its tension-powered predecessors, the trebuchet relied on the fundamental force of gravity. At its core was a simple principle: a long swinging arm mounted on a sturdy frame, with a heavy counterweight on one end and a sling on the other. Raise the weight, let it drop, and the arm would whip around violently, flinging the sling and its deadly payload in a high arc over the enemy's defenses. It was controlled destruction, precise, predictable, and utterly devastating. The origins of the trebuchet can be traced back to early traction models used by the Chinese as early as the 4th century BCE, where human power was used instead of counterweights. But the counterweight trebuchet, the version that would fundamentally change siege warfare in Europe and the Islamic world, appeared in the 12th century, possibly through Byzantine or Muslim intermediaries. Once Europe got the design, it spread quickly through castles and crusades. Its power was astonishing. A well-built trebuchet could launch 300-pound projectiles over 300 meters. Stones the size of household furniture would crash into towers, pulverize walls, or decimate enemy morale. But the real magic was in its arc. Unlike catapults, trebuchets could hurl projectiles over walls with remarkable precision. This meant they were not just battering defenses. They were hitting courtyards, barracks, and supply depots inside the fortifications. And it was not just stones. Trebuchets launched everything imaginable: diseased animals, burning pitch, pots of lime to blind defenders, and even messages or insults wrapped around rocks. One legendary story from the siege of Stirling Castle in Scotland tells of Warwolf, a trebuchet so huge that the enemy surrendered before it was even fired. The king, however, refused to accept the surrender, just so he could test the magnificent machine. But for all its destructive glory, the trebuchet was not fast. It took hours to build, minutes to reload, and required the expertise of skilled engineers. Still, no other siege weapon combined range, force, and psychological horror quite like it. It was the medieval equivalent of a slow-motion hammer falling from the heavens. And when that massive counterweight dropped, cities held their collective breath. While catapults launched from a distance and battering rams smashed the gates, siege towers used a more direct, personal approach. They rolled right up to the enemy's front door and let out armed invaders. Imagine a huge wooden skyscraper on wheels, covered in wet hides to prevent fire, and bristling with archers and spearmen. That was the siege tower, the ancient equivalent of an armored personnel carrier combined with a mobile fortress. And when one of these started rumbling towards your city walls, you knew that the real battle was about to begin. Siege towers were not subtle. They were huge, audacious, and terrifyingly effective when they were used properly. The Assyrians may have been among the first to use them in the 9th century BCE, but it was the Greeks, and especially the Hellenistic kingdoms, who pushed the design to dramatic extremes. During the Siege of Rhodes in 305 BCE, the Macedonian general Demetrius built a 9-story tower called the Helepolis, or Taker of Cities. It stood over 100 feet tall, was equipped with catapults, covered in iron plates, and was pushed by thousands of soldiers. It also, unfortunately, collapsed under its own immense weight, but the sheer ambition behind it was unmatched. The logic behind siege towers was simple. Walls are only effective if you can't get over them. Siege towers negated that advantage by providing a high platform from which attackers could climb down onto the battlements, bypassing gates and scaling ladders. From the top deck, archers could unleash a deadly rain of arrows on the defenders, while troops on the lower levels got ready to board. However, these towers were not invincible. They were slow, could get stuck in the mud, and were prime targets for defenders who were armed with fire arrows, rolling boulders, or even cleverly sabotaged terrain. Clever defenders would dig ditches, flood moats, or build secondary inner walls known as counterscarp, defenses specifically to stop a tower's approach. Still, when they worked as intended, their impact was spectacular. A breach in the wall was one thing, but having your own rampart suddenly overrun by enemy soldiers? That was utter chaos. Siege towers transformed the battlefield from a horizontal contest of strength to a vertical race for survival. They made height both an asset and a liability. And once the gangplank was extended from a siege tower to the city walls, there was no turning back. It was time for brutal hand-to-hand combat. While battering rams smashed and trebuchets soared, some of the most devastating siege tactics happened silently under the ground. Siege tunneling, also known as sapping, was the secret art of defeating a city by literally undermining its foundations. The concept was ancient and terrifyingly effective. Dig a tunnel under the enemy's wall, support it with wooden props, and then set those props on fire. When the timbers burned away, the tunnel would collapse, taking the wall's foundation with it. One moment, your city stood strong. The next, a massive section of the outer wall would crumble like stale bread. This method lacked grand visuals. There were no elaborate engines or thunderous launches, but tunneling was the slow, invisible killer of fortress warfare. The Assyrians used early versions of this, but the technique reached its peak with the Greeks, Persians, and later medieval European armies. During the siege of Plataea in 429 BCE, the Spartans tried to tunnel under the walls, only for the defenders to dig counter-tunnels and meet them in the middle, turning the underground space into a nightmare of knife fights. This defensive tactic became known as counter-mining, and it added a strange new dimension to siege warfare. Imagine soldiers digging in complete darkness, hundreds of feet under the ground, straining to hear the faint sounds of enemy picks. The moment they heard tapping, they would race to intercept, often resulting in violent, claustrophobic fights fought by torchlight with knives and shovels. There was no glory in it, only terror, suffocation, and dirt. But when undermining worked, the results were catastrophic. One of the most infamous examples happened in 1212 during the siege of Rochester Castle in England. King John's forces tunneled under the southern wall, packed the mine with pig fat, and set it on fire. The supports collapsed, bringing down the entire tower above. The defenders were stunned and surrendered soon after. By the 13th century, siege engineers had become specialists in identifying weak foundations, predicting soil behavior, and orchestrating collapses with terrifying precision. They were, in essence, geologists and demolitionists combined. And though tunneling required time, immense labor, and a touch of madness, it proved one fundamental truth about siege warfare. If you could not go over the wall and you could not go through it, you could always bring it down from below. Not all the drama of siege warfare came from the attackers. For every ram that was built or tower that was advanced, the defenders had their own deadly strategies. And sometimes those strategies were exceedingly hot. Let's start with the most terrifying of them all, Greek fire. Developed by the Byzantines around the 7th century CE, Greek fire was a mysterious, napalm-like substance that could stick to ships, walls, and flesh, and it continued to burn even on water. It was sprayed from siphons or thrown in clay pots, and it created scenes of pure chaos. To this day, no one knows its exact formula. The recipe was so closely guarded that it died with the empire itself, but its effects were legendary. Entire fleets were reduced to flaming skeletons in minutes. And that was just the beginning. In more low-tech defenses, boiling liquids were the preferred weapons of choice. Boiling water, oil, or sand would be poured from murder holes, those seemingly quaint openings in the ceilings of gateways or towers, directly onto the invaders below. Oil was particularly feared. Unlike water, it stuck tenaciously to the skin, soaking clothes and armor before catching fire. Imagine climbing a siege ladder only to be met with an unquenchable inferno. Hot sand, while less visually dramatic, was vicious in its own way. It would get into the gaps in armor, especially around the neck or wrists, and cause second- and third-degree burns as it slowly cooked the flesh underneath. It might not have looked impressive from a distance, but it turned brave warriors into screaming wrecks in mere seconds. Defenders also used the fundamental laws of physics. Gravity became a weapon. Huge stones, massive logs, or even dead animals were dropped from the parapets onto siege engines or dense troop formations below. The goal was not just to kill. It was to cripple the machines and shatter morale at the same time. And then there were the traps. Hidden pits, collapsing bridges, and spiked barricades. Castles were turned into intricate puzzles of pain, carefully designed to slow, confuse, and punish. All of this served one crucial purpose: delay. Every minute a wall held meant a minute closer to the enemy's supply lines running out, to disease spreading through their camps, or to reinforcements finally arriving. Siege warfare was a grueling game of attrition, and while the attackers had physics on their side, the defenders had ingenuity and a lot of boiling rage. In siege warfare, raw destruction was only half the goal. The other half was psychological domination, the art of breaking the defenders' will before the walls themselves even fell. Siege weapons were not just tools of war. They were huge, creaking, flaming symbols of impending doom. Every groaning wheel of a siege tower, every arcing boulder thrown by a trebuchet, was designed to plant one terrifying idea in the minds of those behind the walls. You are not safe. Ancient commanders understood this implicitly. The Assyrians openly paraded their siege engines, dragging them across deserts with great fanfare. The Romans built their siege camps right in view of the enemy, allowing the defenders to watch as battering rams were assembled and catapults were tested. Siege was theater, and fear was a crucial part of the script. Sometimes the projectiles themselves carried a message. The severed heads of messengers or generals would be launched over the walls, often still in their armor. At the siege of Constantinople, the defenders were bombarded not only with rocks but with bodies. Diseased corpses were launched to spread panic and plague. During the Mongol siege of Kaffa in 1346, it is believed that throwing plague-infected corpses over the walls contributed to the outbreaks of the Black Death in Europe. The trebuchet was not just a weapon, it was a horrifying announcement. When one of these giants was moved into position, everyone inside the fortress could hear it before they saw it. The creaking of winches, the grinding of ropes, the heavy thunk of the counterweight, like the ominous heartbeat of an approaching storm. But the most perilous part? The sheer unpredictability. You never knew what would come next. Would it be a massive rock, a barrel of fire, a volley of arrows, or just an unnerving silence? An ominous, heavy silence as the engineers carefully adjusted their aim? Even the sounds themselves became psychological weapons. The rhythmic thump of a battering ram or the sudden, pregnant silence before a shot could drive defenders to the brink of madness with anticipation. For commanders, the ultimate goal was to induce despair, to convince the enemy that continuing to resist was futile, that their gods had abandoned them, and that their walls were nothing more than temporary obstacles in the path of inevitable fate. And when that mental dam finally broke, the gates often opened without a fight. Because in siege warfare, sometimes the mind surrendered before the masonry. As gunpowder roared onto the battlefield in the late medieval era, the age of traditional siege engines gradually faded, ending in a slow, splintering demise. But their legacy did not vanish. It transformed. The invention of cannons fundamentally changed everything. A single, precisely aimed shot from a cannon could do in seconds what a trebuchet took hours to accomplish. Stone walls, once considered impregnable, suddenly became grave liabilities. By the 15th century, Europe's magnificent castles were crumbling, not from undermining or fire, but from massive iron balls smashing through their parapets. Siege warfare had entered its next, explosive, brutal, and deafening phase. And yet, the fundamental principles established by ancient siege engineers never truly disappeared. Modern artillery still owes a huge debt to the catapult and the trebuchet. Every ballistic missile and long-range howitzer is simply a high-tech descendant of the same core question. How do you break what is meant to be unbreakable from a distance? Physics, trajectory, tension, and brute force. All these concepts were discovered, tested, and perfected centuries before gunpowder ever entered the historical narrative. Even contemporary military psychology, shock and awe, overwhelming firepower, visible dominance, has its roots in ancient siege tactics. Those towering siege engines, rolling forward with flags snapping in the wind, were the original. Shock and awe. They were not just meant to breach a wall. They were designed to shatter the spirit of an entire city. You can still see their legacy etched into the ruins of ancient cities. At Masada, where Roman siege ramps still scar the desert landscape. At Constantinople, where layers of formidable walls stood for 1,000 years against every imaginable machine, until cannon fire finally brought them down. At castles across Europe, where the architectural evolution of round towers and angled bastions tells the story of a world constantly redesigning itself to withstand the next siege. And today, even in a world dominated by drones and satellite-guided missiles, siege warfare has not vanished. It has simply evolved into a digital form. Cities are still surrounded. Defenders are still isolated. Walls are now firewalls, blockades, or even media blackouts. But the fundamental essence of the siege remains unchanged. Someone wants in. Someone wants to keep them out. And both sides are willing to wait, to build, and to break in order to win. The battering rams are gone. The trebuchets are museum pieces. But the enduring spirit of siege warfare? It is as alive and as destructive as ever.